Good morning, everyone. So this is our first time presenting, so bear with us. But how many of you guys are new to the field, new to underground storage tanks? So, okay, good. A lot of beginners. We are going to cover the basics. We'll go into some detail. At any point, if you guys have questions, please just raise your hand, or any audio issues, just let me know. And how many of you guys are here just for ICC hours? Okay. So hopefully this won't be too boring, but it's always a good comprehensive review. So like I said, if you have questions along the way, just let me know, interrupt at any time, okay? So here's our agenda. It looks lengthy, but we are going to cover a lot of material. We have some breaks thrown in. Of course, if you guys need to get up at any time, please do so. Depending on how we go, how quickly we go, we might deviate a little bit from this, but this is the general guidelines. So first, before we get into anything, we'll talk about definitions, so we all are on the same page. We'll review laws and regulations. Steve will discuss UST inspections, go into operational requirements, whether it be paperwork or the physical inspection, recordable and reportable releases, monitoring and response plan, and then I'll come back in and talk about corrosion protection. And within the UST system, we'll also discuss spill containment, overfill prevention, under dispenser containment, and that type of monitoring. Tank monitoring requirements will be a big section, so we'll do that right before lunch, and then we'll break before we talk about pipe monitoring, which is another big section, as well as VPH tanks, the post-2004 tanks. Another break, which is always nice, and then we'll finish with testing requirements, licensing and certification, and red tag and alternative fuels, just to wrap it up. Okay? And if I use any acronyms or any words you guys are unfamiliar with, just let me know. Some of these words, we just become second nature to us. Okay, so before we get started, let's talk about what an underground storage tank is, so we're all on the same page here. It means any one or combination of tanks, including the pipe that's connected, that is used for the storage of hazardous substances and is substantially beneath the surface of the ground. So you might ask, well, what does that mean? What does substantially or totally beneath the surface of the ground mean? Substantially beneath the surface of the ground is an actual definition in Title 23 CCR. And it means that at least 10% of the underground tank system, which is the entire system, volume, including the connected piping, is below the surface of the ground. So what's an underground tank system? So that's going to include the underground storage tank, as well as the connected piping, plus any ancillary equipment and secondary containment. Let's define what a pipe is in terms of underground storage tanks. Basically, it means that all parts of any pipeline or system of pipelines that's used in conjunction with the storage of hazardous substances. Okay? Here's just a quick overview, so you have a visual of what we're talking about during our whole presentation. This is a good picture. It shows what you as a consumer might see at a gas station, but also what's underneath the ground. So you have your dispenser, and then your under dispenser containment and piping, which we'll go into lots of detail, and of course the tank here. And you can see in the background you have a fuel truck dropping fuel, and we'll get into details on all parts of this system and the different components and monitoring as well. Okay, and here's a schematic, just so that we can kind of get to be on the same page with what we're talking about regarding equipment, containment. So on the bottom here you have the tank, and the orange piping, that's the product piping that's going to the dispenser. Okay, so that's going to deliver the fuel to the car, and then you have your vapor recovery pipe, which is that dashed yellow line. And that's going to bring the vapors back to the tank, which will condense in the tank. And then you have a typical setup where you have a STP sump. STP stands for submersible turbine sump, also called the piping sump. And then you have your fill sump. So here's just some basic components, and we'll go into details on each of these along the way. So any questions before we move on? No? Okay. Okay, we'll get this out of the way. A little bit talk about laws and regulations. So the question is, what is law? What is regulation? We hear these terms all the time in the field as regulators. So law is a binding or enforceable rule. At the state level, these laws are enacted by state legislatures, and it empowers agencies to create regulations, okay? So regulations are written to implement the authority of the laws, and they are the words, I guess, or the basis that will provide the details and procedures to implement that law. Okay, and although regulations are subordinate, they also have the force of law. And I know from personal experience, I reference regulations way more than I do law, but that's where you find the details. That's going to tell you what you need to do to be in compliance with the law. And which laws and regulations are applicable to the UST program here in the state of California? First and foremost, you have Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, Title 40. And this is going to affect the entire United States, okay? Here in California, we work with Health and Safety Code, Chapter 6.7, which is the law. And then our regulation document is California Code of Regulations, Title 23. And then most CUPAs have their own local ordinance that also has some additional information. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about each one of those. So at the federal level, you have Title 40, and this was developed and published by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, also known as EPA. They're going to enforce Subtitle 1 of the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, also known as RCRA, a term you all probably have heard of. And Parts 280 to 281 is where you're going to find the UST technical requirements. California, we have Health and Safety Code, like I said, which is law, and it provides the basic framework for the California UST program. The applicable chapters would be 6.7, which is the underground storage of hazardous substances, and Chapter 6.75, which is going to discuss the UST financial responsibility, which will affect those that have petroleum in their tanks. And then Title 23, that's our regulation. California Code of Regulations is the official term, and it's going to give you the specific requirements. Okay, this is what's going to allow you to comply with Chapter 6.7 of Health and Safety Code. And then, of course, your local ordinance. And for example, us being from San Diego, we reference San Diego County Code of Regulatory Ordinances, Title 6, Division 8, Chapter 10. And the specifics that you can find in our ordinance is going to be the operation permits, permitting, and any delinquency items. Okay, this is just a visual to show you have the federal CFR. That's going to cover the entire United States. As you go up the pyramid, it gets more specific. You have your California laws and regs, and then of course at the top of the pyramid you have your local ordinances or guidances. The other interesting thing to note about this pyramid is that you can never be less stringent than the level below. So California can be more stringent than federal, which it is, and local can even be more stringent than California law. So some CUPAs might have requirements that are not necessarily found at another CUPA, which is always a real treat for all the tank testers and service technicians as they move from the different jurisdictions. But you can be more stringent, you just cannot be less stringent. So this is just a visual to show that. Here's a summary, Chapter 6.7. We'll address some of these different aspects as we go throughout the presentation. You're always going to have definitions in the beginning in both 6.7 and Title 23, and we'll get into some of those as we proceed. You're going to have exemptions, and we'll definitely go into some detail on the exemptions, whether it be piping exemptions or tank exemptions. This is where you find information on your operation permits as well. Design and construction requirements. This is going to tell you what you need at the design level, depending on the install date for your tank systems. Financial responsibility is also addressed here in Chapter 6.7. enhanced leak detection, release reporting, and penalties as well. Title 23 is filled with articles. You're going to find your definitions, your general provisions, and then Article 3 and 4 will go into detail on new USTs and existing USTs and those requirements. Release reporting, repair and upgrade requirements. Article 7 talks about closure, whether it be temporary closure or permanent closure. Site-specific variances can be found in Article 8. Article 9 talks about local agency request for additional design and construction requirements. Article 10 will be quarterly reports and trade secrets, as well as permit applications. A little bit of detail on red tag authority, which we will address at the end of the presentation in Article 10.5. And Article 11 is corrective action, and 12 will be electronic submission of lab data. So as you can see, some of these we don't refer to quite as often as, say, Article 3 and Article 4. You all might have already figured out which ones you have tabbed. Then, of course, there's various appendices that you can refer to as well for additional information. Okay, so I've highlighted, at least in our experience, the most frequently used statutes and regs, and these four address basically the tank installation and the dates. That's when we're trying to figure out what's going on with the system, the first question we ask usually is, what is the install date? Because the install date will let you know where you fall within the regs and what requirements this particular system would need. So from Chapter 6.7, we have 25-292, and those are going to address the tanks that were installed on or before January 1st, 1984. So as I mentioned, we've used the term existing. These are existing tanks. And we'll get to that in a little bit as well. After January 1st, 84, you have your requirements for those tanks, and that can be found in 25-291. 25-290.2 and .1 involve the tanks that had some changes in July of 03 and 04. So we'll get into details, and then of course, after July 1st, 2004, we're gonna talk in great detail about VPH systems, or continuous monitoring systems. Title 23, Article 3 to 4 are the most popular, the most used. Article 3 is a new tank. They talk about construction and monitoring requirements. And new underground storage tank means an underground storage tank, which is not an existing storage tank, so that's easy enough. But what's an existing underground tank? Installed on or before January 1st, 84, or if you're on a farm, an existing tank would also be a tank that was installed before January 1st, 87, but it also need to have a capacity greater than 1,100 gallons and stores motor vehicle fuel for purposes of that business, the agricultural equipment. So of course, with every law, every regulation, we have exemptions. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about that. So what does it mean? If you have an exempt tank, what does that really mean? If UST is exempt from either Chapter 6.7 or Title 23, that means it's not subject to these regulations or the law. Title 23, Section 2621 will go into detail on the exemptions, and then Chapter 6.7, you have these three sections which will go into detail, and it'll describe the tank exemptions and some of the piping exemptions as well. Okay, so we'll start with Title 23, and there's about, I forget how many exactly, but about 15 or 16 exemptions. And I like to think of Section 2621 discusses the exemptions based on definition. This type of tank either is or is not exempt. Whereas with health and safety code, I feel like there's more criteria that need to be met, so it's not quite as cut and dry. I'll just run through them right here, but you'll notice that most of these are highlighted, and the reason they're highlighted is that these actually have definitions in Title 23. So if you're uncertain if you do have this type of tank, you can look it up and get a little bit more detail and information on these types of tank. Liquid asphalt tank, there was no definition, but it's fairly self-explanatory. So We're looking at farm tanks, heating oil tanks, hydraulic lift tanks, liquefied petroleum gas tanks, liquid asphalt, septic tank, a sump, pit, pond, or lagoon. And there's more. So, wastewater treatment tank. And then, like I said, these are also highlighted because these are defined, because they might not be completely clear when you're first reading into this. You might not be sure if you have this type of tank. So stormwater, wastewater collection system, and then tanks containing radioactive materials, they're also going to be exempt. And then emergency containment tanks, and those must be kept empty at all times. We get, as a CUPA, stormwater, wastewater collection systems, emergency containment tanks, we get quite a few projects coming from businesses trying to figure out if they actually meet that definition. And oftentimes they get pulled into our special project assistance program so we can work with them to help them determine if they meet those requirements. And it can be a lengthy process. It's not quite as cut and dry as you might think. But we do offer that service. We can bring people in and have them go through the process with us to help them meet that exemption and make sure they have certain SOPs in place so that they can continue to maintain this exemption. Oh, and there's more. So I was right, there's about 16 of them. So of course, drums located in basements and contain 55 gallons or less are exempt. Hazardous waste, as defined in section 25.316 of Health and Safety Code. And then of course, your tanks and associated piping located in a vault or basement. And those exemptions are in 25.283.5, and we'll go into some detail on those. It's kind of a little bit of a hot topic. And then, of course, anything that's specifically exempt per 25.281Y of Health and Safety Code. Okay, so now we're starting to get some pictures to liven things up here, but here's an example of an exempt tank. Any guesses what this might be? Heating oil? Yeah, that's right. So heating oil tank, and this is a definition that can be found if you wanted more detail. So this is going to be a tank located in a personal residence, and it's going to hold no more than 1,100 gallons of home heating oil, but it needs to be used consumptively at the premises where the tank is located. Okay? So because this type of tank is exempt, as I mentioned before, it's not subject to Title 23 or Chapter 6.7. So we often get calls about heating oil tanks, whether they need a permit with San Diego County to remove them. And the answer is no, because they are exempt. But we often recommend that they pull a permit just so that they have record. A lot of it gets lost, and it becomes important when they're trying to resell the property. So sometimes exempt tanks still come through our plan check process just so that they can have records of what was actually done with the tank. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little specifically about the 25.283.5 exemption. And some examples of these, just to give you a visual, are going to be tanks in a vault or tanks located in a basement. Because don't forget, these types of tanks are still below the surface of the ground, and most of the time substantially beneath the surface of the ground. So depending on how they're built and how they're set up, they can get out of those regulations, even though they are beneath the surface of the ground, with this exemption. And like I mentioned before, I feel like Title 23 gives you, specific definitions for an exempt tank, whereas 25.283.5 gives you a list of criteria. So your goal is that your tank meets this criteria. So I'll go over them quickly here. All exterior surfaces of the tank, including the connected piping, must be monitored by direct viewing, including the bottom of the tank. And the structure that it's in must provide for secondary containment for the contents of the tank. And with this criteria, the owner-operator must conduct weekly inspections and maintain a log for review by the local agency. And of course, the UST must meet requirements that are equal to or more stringent than those imposed by the chapter, by Chapter 6.7. So it can be, especially with number 4, it can be a little bit of a case-by-case basis. They're all just a little bit different. Some are easier to exempt than others. And we've had situations where they almost meet the exemption criteria, but the piping might not be visual, and they have gone through plan check to correct that, so they could meet this exemption. And here's just an example. This is at a typical oil change facility, and these tanks are in a below-grade structure, and they do meet all the criteria, and they actually went through, like I mentioned, we have our Special Projects Assistance Program, and they came to us so they could work with us to make sure that their tanks met these exemption criteria. Because for a lot of their sites, they actually had to move some tanks around so that they could meet the criteria. But if you notice here, it's hard to tell a little bit, but you have sufficient distance for direct viewing, whether it's the sides of the tanks, and then of course on the bottom. It's not very large, but it's big enough. You'll know if there's a leak coming from the bottom of that tank. And then, although you can't see it, just so you know, it does meet the criteria. All the connected piping is contained within the basement, and they put in place operating procedures that allowed them to maintain their exemption to be equally stringent to Chapter 6.7. Okay, and then I also wanted to discuss a more recent addition to Chapter 6.7, and it's Section 25281.6. And this is going to be an exemption for emergency generator tank systems that are located in a below-grade structure. So they have a different set of exemption requirements, and they're actually, in my opinion, a little bit less strict. Similar to 25283.5, they still need to have exterior surfaces of the tank, piping, and the floor need to be inspected. However, they have the option of direct viewing. They have the option of cameras or other visual aids such as video equipment. So they don't have to actually have a person present as you would with the previous exemption. Okay? Also, they need to provide secondary containment for the tank contents. And then they also must do visual inspection, but it's not as frequent. It's once a month or when they operate the tank. However, also to meet this exemption, you need to have a cumulative capacity of 1,100 gallons or less of diesel fuel. So it's slightly different, but it is specific to emergency generator tanks. Okay, and then some additional exclusions I wanted to bring up, just because we have had questions. But you have your vent lines, your vapor recovery lines, and your fill pipes that are designed to prevent and do not hold standing fluid in the pipes or lines. So they are exempt as well. Unburied fuel delivery piping at marinas are exempt. And then unburied fuel piping connected to an emergency generator tank system also are exempt. However, like I said, we'll get into some detail on underground tank systems that were installed after July 1st of '03. But those tank systems, the portions of vent lines and vapor recovery lines and fill pipes that are beneath the surface of the ground do not meet this exclusion. So post-2003 tank installs, these three types of piping are now part of the pipe definition. So they're not going to meet that exclusion. So that's where it becomes real important to know the date, the installation date of your system. So if you have a single wall vent line, you're going to hope or assume that it was installed before July 1st, 2003, because you would expect a post-July 1st, 2003 tank to have a double wall vent line similar to the product piping. So like I said, that's where the dates are probably the most important piece of information you could start with in terms of determining the requirements for a system. Okay, and here's just some pictures of, this is Marina piping. We have quite a few marinas down in San Diego, and we have one inspector who's dedicated to doing these types of inspections. And you'll notice this is single wall piping, and this is not a problem. Here's another view of that same piping. So like I said, this is one of the other exemptions that you could have for piping. That's more of an unusual system, and some of you might not have these in your jurisdictions, obviously. Well, here's an example of, and I forgot to mention when I was talking about laws and regs, although we have our UST program laws and regs, there's still potentially other jurisdictions that will have some requirements, such as fire departments. And here's one example of where this is emergency generator piping. And although it's able to be visually monitored, it didn't actually need to be double walled because it does meet the exemption definition. But per fire code, they wanted it double walled, at least in San Diego, city of San Diego, within our county. I'm not super familiar with fire code issues, but our fire inspectors in San Diego wanted to have this double walled, and I'm not, someone might, let me know if that's actually a requirement per fire code or that was just specific at San Diego level. But here's just a visual example of emergency generator piping that is above grade and able to be visually monitored. Okay, we're gonna have a series of quizzes just to keep you guys on your toes, keep you awake. So California, just shout out the answer. California USTs are regulated by what two bodies of law? If you guys don't tell me, I'm gonna pick on the few San Diego people I see in here. Health and Safety Code, what else? Title 23, that's right. Okay, can a local ordinance, such as our San Diego ordinance, can it be less stringent than state law? No, that's right. However, it can be more stringent, so keep that in mind. Couple more questions. Is a septic tank regulated as a UST in California? No, it's exempt per section 2621, that's in Title 23. Okay, if a tank is exempt per section 25283 of Health and Safety Code, and remember that was the vaulted tank exemption, how often must it be inspected? That's right, once a week. And those inspections must be logged. Okay, UST inspections. I'm gonna turn this over to Steve Kahn. So before we move on, any questions? No? Yes.
Bottom of a vaulted tank and a jimmy loop,
Uh-huh.
a wheel changer, that space that you were showing in your slide, which is difficult,
Yes.
these sites, is that much. How do you call that direct viewing? It's just a question that I've got, certainly.
Well, we've gotten hands and knees, flashlight, and look underneath.
And
That's good enough for San Diego.
We expect our operators to do that also.
In theory, yes.
Okay.
And to log it as well.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, as with any requirement that does not involve our oversight, I mean, that's what they need to do to stay compliant. But, I mean, most tanks are on the skids where you get the 1 or 2 inches. And getting some feedback here. We feel that that's enough. We can take a peek under with a flashlight and you'll see it. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's gonna run out. You're gonna get it, I think, in sufficient time. Yes.
The other part about a vaulted tank is oftentimes with the oil changers, they'll have because they're below grade, they'll have a sump pump, right, to kick the water out. So we've got to have secondary containment for that
Right.
tank.
We make sure that it's not an automatic sump pump, because it does need. Can you guys hear the question? Good. We make sure that it's not an automatic sump pump, that they would actually have to activate it to get it to work. So, okay, good. Sure. Okay, so here's Steve Kahn. He's going to talk about UST inspections.